Hello, I'm Chuck Martin here at the AI Summit. I'm very happy to say we've got the very stellar Laurence Moroney, AI Advocacy for Lead for Google. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, enjoying the sun.
Yeah, there's sun for sure.
There's plenty of it.
So you've been dealing with this for a long time. I mean, before it was cool, really.
That's always been cool.
Tell me about some of the hype around this right now, because generative AI has been explosive, obviously.
Yeah, so I always like to think about it using the Gartner hype cycle. And you know the way the Gartner hype cycle, it begins with a technology trigger, and then there's this massive peak of inflated expectations before one falls into the spectacularly named trough of disillusionment, and then after that you climb up to productivity. So what has happened, I think, in the AI industry over the last few years is that, we've been dragging people along that curve into the trough of disillusionment, helping people to understand, what AI is, and just as importantly, what it isn't, before they can start getting productive, that they can start building things with it. But then the whole generative explosion happened, particularly with the release of ChatGPT, and the industry has kind of been dragged back behind the hype cycle. And there's a lot of hypey type news, there's a lot of hypey type fear-mongering and scary stuff, as well as all of the good stuff saying like, hey, you can do this, and you can do that, and you can do the other. So it's like part of the job right now is to really figure out the signal from the noise, so we can start dragging people back along the curve. And the one thing I've noticed in my years in working in this is that it's not necessarily one person's better than another, or one company is better than another. They're just further along the hype cycle. So, I always like to say it's my job is to tunnel you through that peak of inflated expectations and make you disillusioned.
So what are companies expecting that's not real?
I think there's many things, right? On the positive side, the expectations that aren't real as that stuff that's generative, like generative graphics or generative text, can do a lot more than it actually can. For example, there's a token limit. Right, I keep seeing things, for example, where there's a fear that somebody can say you can enter a prompt and like a model can write a book for you or write a screenplay, but it's only got an 8,000 token limit, so that's going to be a very short book or a very short screenplay, and usually the longer it goes, the more context gets lost. So stuff like that, it's not there yet, and it may never be, and maybe it should never be. So that's one great example of where it's like these things aren't nearly as powerful as sometimes the headlines would make you believe. And then on the flip side of that, though, is that when people do understand them and people are able to start using them, then they could be used for misleading things, or they could be used for damaging things. Like we also like some of the pictures that were automatically generated of a certain former popular US politician on the run from the police, and stuff like that. So it's like, these are all things that are living in that part of the hype cycle where it's like people are experimenting and people are beginning to do things that can be good as well as can be bad.
So you mentioned should and should not. What do you think should be done with this, and what do you think should not be done?
I mean, I think, it's not for me to tell people what they should or should not do, of course, but I think one of the things is that if we can get into the mindset of using these to enhance the work that a human does, to make a human more productive, to be able to let humans scale better than they do today, I mean, I think that can clearly belong in the should category, right? And then if these are things that can be used destructively, can be used to impact somebody negatively, can be used to automate or scale destructive behaviors, I would say that's the kind of thing that perhaps should be in the should not category. But there's certainly a gray area there, and it's the kind of thing that the more people who are involved in this, the wider the access is to this, and the more people who understand how the technology works from a technological level, then the more of us there are out there who can determine the shoulds and the should nots. Right. It shouldn't be in the hands of a few.
So what worries you about this these days? Because you're dealing with this all the time.
I think, oh my gosh, there's so many that I would worry about that I can't really, we wouldn't have time to list them all, but I think one of the things that I do worry about, at least in the short term, is the misrepresentation of this to the extent that it could be damaging of innovation in this space. Right, there are a lot of misrepresentative headlines. AI will take jobs away, AI will write books for us or movies for us or those kind of things. And if the cacophony of that noise grows too large, then suddenly the motive to innovate in that space, to be able to drive business in that space goes away, and we effectively can throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that's one thing that I think is that we really, really have to be careful about the negative signals that are being sent in some cases to make sure that we don't destroy innovation in that space. I think that's one thing that I definitely worry about for sure. I think then, of course, the other things are, of course, the well-documented ways that bad actors can use these things that we need to understand. It's like when the internet first came out there, like we could make a guess about how bad actors could use it, but nobody could have possibly guessed every way that a bad actor could use it for phishing and scamming and all of that kind of thing until it was out there and it was being actively used. And if too much time was spent prior to the internet being released saying we should stop this and we should stop that and overhype this and overhype the negativity of that, we may never have gotten the internet, right? So it's those kind of things, that kind of balance is something that worries me. How do we ensure that we have a balance that allows innovation to go forward and allows us to understand how to use this well and how to use it effectively, while also putting guardrails in place to prevent bad actors from misusing it.
And these bad actors, they're creating things like the video you mentioned, where in the photo you mentioned, where we're actually seeing things that they look like they're real. It's like hallucination for GPT. Yeah. It's like, it looks real. Is that going to get so good that you can't tell?
I think images can get so good that you can't tell that they're generated for sure, and we're already beginning to see that happen because it's moving so fast. But I think what can be done to prevent a bad actor misleading people in that way is to do two things, right? Number one, to be able to watermark images to show that they are generated, and that's one of the things that we've been working on. But then also number two is to build effective guardrails and effective tools that allow a machine to look at an image to determine if it's generated or not. There are things that can fool the human eye that may not fool the machine, right? So often the way that the diffusion models that are done to be able to create images, the diffusion process works both ways, forwards and backwards, that you can actually put tools in there to be able to look at something to see if that came about as a result of a diffusion model, so that even if it could fool the human eye, you could put machines in place to say that this is, quite likely a generated image. Check your sources, that kind of thing. And then the optimist in me also kind of says that the more we get exposed to this kind of thing, the less we are likely to be fooled by it. Right? Once upon a time, when I got an email from somebody saying that, hey, there's like one of my relatives in a particular country has died and there's a $10 billion inheritance in my name, I might have gone, really? And I read into it a little bit more. Nowadays, when I see that kind of thing, I know it's a scam, right? The more you get exposed to that kind of thing, the more you begin to identify it. And I think this will continue to happen with generated stuff as well.
How do you see the big technology companies kind of integrating their technology, if at all? We've got IBM with Watson X, obviously, we've got Bing, we've got Google, obviously. What does that look like in the future?
What is it like to integrate generative into our technology?
Technologically, are they going to be separate silo company approaches, or are they going to all work together?
Good question. There's no particular standard for that yet, and I think at some point eventually some standard will grow. They generally do, right? Standards have grown for everything from the internet to data to whatnot. So I would say eventually that standard will grow, but it's not there yet. So to begin the answer to that question, I think every company will integrate it differently depending on their business verticals, right? Companies like Google, who, one of our primary businesses, of course, is search. How do we start integrating generative stuff into search to make search better? You don't make search better by hallucinating things. You don't make search better by making stuff up, but you do make search better by having a great conversational interface, right? So like some of the things that are in these models, even though they're called generative models, they are also very, very good at understanding language, parsing context from language, as well as parsing content from language, and then you can build a better search as a result. Other things like, for example, one of my favorite uses of these models is document summarization, creating a TLDR, right? How many times have you received a document in your email that has 20 pages and you got 5 minutes to read it? And again, it's not generative, it's effectively using its understanding of language to be able to pull context out of a document to create a TLDR. There's lots of these kind of uses, depending on the context, depending on where you are, that can be done, and I think everybody's going to do it differently depending on their business vertical.
So where do ethics and bias come in all of this?
Well, they're very important, of course, right? As soon as you, what is it the Spider-Man's uncle said, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So and I think that's where they come into this. The greater the power that we're able to have by automating things, the greater the responsibility we have to get it right. And then the ethics come into like our belief in what we should do and the amount of calories we should burn on doing it right, as opposed to the amount of calories we should burn on building something profitable. And how do you do that balance? So different companies are going to do that in different ways. At Google, we've come up with our standards that we say for producing AI systems, our responsibility standards, and they fuel everything that we do to make sure that they're listed on our website. I haven't memorized them, and one of the things that I've really particularly enjoy that we've done is that we've been building AI systems for a very, very long time, and these have come out as a result of us building our own systems. I always love to give one example, and it's like, I joined Google almost 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years in October. And when I did my first training in Google, I was like sitting in a training room for like a couple of weeks, and they told us like how machine learning to build AI systems is used in Google. That's used in so many places, and one of them was that we're very famous for having free food. Right? Breakfast, lunch, and then some days is dinner. But if you're a company that provides free food to employees, you're pretty much scrutinized because food could be wasted. And it's like, saying it's excess, and particularly nowadays when, it's like, it's harder to make a dime than it used to be, that a company that provides free food can be seen as excessive. So Google have applied machine learning even at that to make sure that the kitchens produce enough food but not too much food so that we don't have wastage. And even in the office that I'm based in the Seattle area, it's like our wastage of food is less than any other restaurants or anything like that, because of the use of machine learning and AI. And like we've been doing that for a long, long time. It was 10 years ago I joined, they'd been doing it from beforehand. So putting together from our experience, here's how you build things responsibly, here's how you build things for people, as well as being able to drive a business around that, and then opening that up so that anybody else can follow the same guidelines or adopt them for their own use, I think that's a very ethical thing.
So is that well beyond predictive modeling? I mean, is it true?
So in the food case, it was predictive modeling. It was a case of like, one funny thing is like sometimes on Wednesdays they serve barbecue, and when they serve barbecue, a lot more people show up because I guess people like barbecue, so at least in the Kirkland office, that's what they do. So it's like the predictive model would say, well, if you're serving this particular type of food, let's take a look at the historic use of that and let's project how much of that that we should cook and how much of that we should serve, and let's minimize waste as a result.
So a year from now, we're having this conversation.
You always ask me that one.
Yeah. Are we still going to talk about generative AI? Will it be the next generation of it? Will it be something new that we don't know yet?
I think a year from now, or maybe 18 months from now, if I go by the Moore's Law, I think one of the things that we'll be talking about is, and one of the things I'm most excited about in generative AI, is making models smaller. Right now, the GPTs and the BARDs of the world are huge. They cost a lot to run. They cost a lot to train, but they're general purpose models that can do just about anything language-wise, right? You can go to them and you can ask them to give you a haiku, give you source code, write you a song in the style of U2, or any of these kind of things, but it's like very few people need that breadth of ability, but many people need narrow focus, like let's generate source code, let's write a screenplay, let's do these kind of things, or let's analyze a screenplay to understand what works and what doesn't, and to be able to bring the generalization of the language, but with the specific type of thing, that specific vertical. Now suddenly you don't need these massive models to do that. You can probably do that in smaller models, and when those smaller models will run on a desktop instead of a data center, now what kind of scenarios get opened? And I personally think that maybe 18 months from now, that will be the conversation, right? Should I be using this company's model for generating source code, or should I be using that company's model for generating source code? This one is cheaper, that one does better, those kind of things. And I think that's where the logjam of innovation, I think, is really gonna just flow, so that once we're able to get models small enough to be able to do that kind of thing, and that's when it's gonna get really exciting.
Well, I look forward to that conversation. Thank you so much.
See you in 18 months.
18 months.